welcome or welcome back to my channel. If you're thinking of moving to Italy, then congratulations on taking the first step towards hopefully living your dream. I myself did it a year and a half ago and haven't looked back. That being said, there are a few things you need to be aware of before you take the leap, so let's dive straight in. Number one, regional dialects. Italy has roughly 34 dialects, and I say roughly because there is no strict definition of a dialect. And they can broadly be categorised into the northern dialects, the Tuscan and central dialects, and those in the south. There seems to be a common misconception in the UK that dialects just mean strong accents, which you might find quite commonly in the UK, but actually they have their own vocabulary and their own grammatical systems. And on top of that, they can vary from town to town within a region that broadly speaks the same dialect. So what that means as a foreigner coming to Italy is that even if you've put in the hard work to learn Italian, which I really hope you have, you might find yourself in many situations where you still don't understand a word that's being said. Nowadays, of course, standard Italian is taught in schools and used in the media, etc. So everyone will be able to translate for you if you ask nicely. But my grandparents' generation, for example, still didn't speak or write standard Italian. I personally grew up in a household where Neapolitan was spoken, which is one of the more distinctive southern dialects. And I spoke fluent standard Italian before I moved here. And yet I still haven't mastered the Abruzzo dialect. Although I understand most of it, I do often still find myself in situations where I have to hold my hands up and just say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand a word of that. So I feel for you if you're in that situation. Number two, eating habits. Italy is a country with many rules on what you should eat, how you should eat, and when. But I feel like a lot of people have already discussed those points, so I'm not going to go into them today. However, there is one thing that surprised me about life in Italy, and that's just how common it is to go out for breakfast every single day. In the UK, if I were to go out for breakfast every morning, I think it would set me back at least £5 to £6 for a huge bucket of watery, tasteless coffee and a dry old pastry. Yes, I'm talking about you, Costa. Whereas here, to get my cappuccino and cornetto, we're talking about just over €2. So it's well worth it for value for money, but it's also a really good meeting hub. I work from home, so it's really the only time of day where I get to have conversations with other people. So it's really good for my mental health to have that daily interaction. Something else I should mention is that Italian breakfast tends to be sweet, although some people do opt for a filled roll. I have my cappuccino and cornetto at the bar every morning, and I should make you aware that a cornetto is not a croissant. You'll make people very angry if you don't make that distinction. It's a pastry that looks similar in shape to a croissant, but it's made differently and is filled with something delicious like Nutella or pistachio cream or even Kinder Bueno, and they are fantastic. Obviously not so great for the waistline, but hey, you're in Italy, who cares? Side note, flavoured syrups for your coffee are really not popular here, although Starbucks has had the audacity to open in a few Italian cities. Outrageous. Number three, the country of contradictions. Now, you probably already know this if you've ever visited Italy, but it can be quite surprising for a foreigner moving here to see that these quite contrasting values can coexist within one culture. For example, Italians are known to be very expressive, and it's not uncommon to see public displays of affection or a heated argument in the middle of the street. However, in other ways, Italians can be very conservative. There seems to be a specific way for doing everything, and if you don't follow it to the T, you're considered quite strange. This is especially true in my case because I'm someone that's never really followed the crowd. I do what I think is right and it doesn't really bother me what everyone else is doing. And on top of that, I have mini pigs as pets, which everyone here thinks is completely bonkers, but I'm okay with that. And it might be more specific to the fact I live in a very small mountain community, and I'm sure that attitudes are probably a bit more open-minded in the bigger cities. Oddly, this contradictory mentality can apply to law enforcement as well. And you might find that you're fined for something very minimal and trivial, but then treated with much more leniency for something you would consider more serious. So that's another thing that might surprise you. Number four, the health obsession. Now, I don't mean to offend any Italians by saying this. You're outliving the Brits by a good few years, so you're obviously doing something right. But in my experience over the last year and a half, the average Italian knows a lot more about human anatomy and health than your average Brit. And that can sometimes translate into a teeny bit of hypochondria. If you're coming from the UK, the chances are that 20 degrees is going to feel fairly warm to you, and it often reaches those temperatures in October, November, and early spring. But it doesn't matter how warm it is outside. If it's not summer and you're not wearing your thick woolly vest under your clothes, then you may be at risk of catching the colpo d'aria, literally a hit of air, which can cause a myriad of health problems for you. The Italians say that you can get this colpo d'aria from things like going from hot to cold conditions, or from having the air conditioning on, or just sitting in a draft, and it can cause problems such as backache, a stiff neck, and even abdominal pain. So you have been warned to wrap up if you don't want people constantly telling you that you're about to get sick. And finally, number 5, death. Now, bear with me, I know that might sound like a strange thing to say, but I feel like in the UK, death is a topic that makes people uncomfortable and generally people avoid speaking about it. Whereas in Italy, it just feels like death is more of a part of life. Let me explain how. In Italy, when someone dies, almost immediately you'll find that these posters pop up on notice boards or billboards with a picture of the deceased and a few words about them, which I think would possibly make people quite uncomfortable in the UK, but here it's just a normal part of life, and then as soon as somebody else dies, those pictures are covered up and the next lot of what they call manifesti will appear in their place. And then generally speaking, the body is displayed at the home of the deceased person in an open casket, and people will continue to flood there throughout the day to go and visit the dead body. Again, not something I feel that people would be comfortable with in the UK. Where I live, it's quite a close-knit community, so even casual acquaintances would attend the funeral, which is amazing to see. You'll often see hordes of people outside the church because they can't fit in, there to pay their respects. And in fact, I'm off to the funeral of my doctor, sadly, this afternoon, and I'm sure there's going to be an enormous turnout. Once upon a time, funerals would also be attended by professional mourners who would be paid to follow the coffin and wail loudly dressed in black, but I'm pretty sure that that tradition has now died, excuse the pun. I've been thinking about why it might be that Italians feel more comfortable with the idea of death, and I've come up with a couple of ideas. One is that natural disasters are more common in Italy, so if you're living under the shadow of a volcano, for example, you probably do become more aware of the fact that life is very fragile and you learn to accept that. Secondly, I believe there's a deeper spiritual connection to the afterlife here, and that's evident particularly in Napoli, where a mass cemetery was actually created for the thousands and thousands of people that lost their lives to the plague in the 17th century. And there is just a collection of skulls there, and people will go there and actually adopt a skull and pray for their soul so that they can leave purgatory and ascend into heaven, obviously in return for a little something for themselves. This probably sounds quite morbid or even shocking to some people, but I believe Neapolitans like praying to the skulls because they're something more tangible than praying to a saint that you've never seen before. I'm really hoping to get to Naples soon to visit this cemetery, so I will let you know if I make it to the crypt, and make sure you look out for that video. Other cultural differences that didn't quite make the list but are worth a mention are: men have handbags, my partner included. There are these terrible, terrible green bugs called stink bugs, which infest the houses during certain times of the year, and as the name suggests, if you crush them, they make a nauseating odour. In general, kids don't go to bed early like they do in the UK, so if you're going out in the evening, chances are kids will be there with their parents. Also, the public transport here is amazing and so much cheaper than the UK, so that's definitely a bonus. The drinking culture is very different here to in the UK. There are much more relaxed attitudes towards drinking in terms of maybe giving a little glass of wine to somebody underage, but binge drinking is definitely not part of the culture and is something that is frowned upon. Oh, and I'm considered blonde, which surprised me, although my hair does look a lot lighter on camera than it does in real life. And I think that's pretty much it. Make sure you subscribe if you want further information on life in Italy, and see you again soon.